By the end of the 1920s, it really felt like the world had finally caught its breath after the Great War. It seemed like there was a fragile peace. So how did all of that hope just collapse? How does simmering resentment boil over into a full-scale global nightmare? Well, that's what we're going to unpack. So, what was the spark that lit the fuse? The world had spent a decade rebuilding, but the foundation it was all built on was, well, a lot weaker than anyone thought. And that foundation? Yeah, it was about to completely crumble. And believe me, fell off a cliff is not an exaggeration. The 1929 stock market crash kicked off a domino effect across the entire planet. Banks went under, jobs just vanished, and whole countries were suddenly drowning in poverty and despair. I mean, we're not talking about a simple recession here. This was a total free-fall collapse. And this is the key takeaway, right? The economic chaos, it created this perfect breeding ground for political extremism. People were desperate, they were angry, and they were looking for someone, anyone, to blame. And you better believe there were charismatic leaders just waiting in the wings, ready to point the finger and give them an enemy. And this is where things get really interesting, because the story kind of splits. In the middle of this worldwide crisis, two huge powers, Germany and Japan, they both turned to dictatorship. But they got there on completely different roads. So let's really dig into how each of them went down this dark path. Okay, so let's start with Germany. The rise of the Nazi Party is it's a wild story, because it was what you could call a bottom-up takeover. What's so crazy about their story is that they used the democratic system against itself. They literally used the rules of the game to destroy the game from the inside. And the guy leading the charge? Honestly, by all accounts, Adolf Hitler was a typical loser from much of his early life. He was a failed art student, rejected, living on the streets at one point. But in the army and then later in the rowdy beer halls of post-war Germany, he discovered he had this one absolutely stunning talent, public speaking. He could tap into the raw anger of a nation and just unleash it. And his method? It was brilliant in a truly terrifying way. First up, propaganda. He created a powerful brand with unforgettable symbols like the swastika and his disciplined brown shirts. Then he used that brand to win elections until the Nazis were the biggest party in the country. And think about that. He didn't have to storm the palace with an army. He was invited in, appointed chancellor, totally legally. And once he had his foot in the door, he manufactured a crisis, the burning of the parliament building, blamed his enemies, and used it as an excuse to seize absolute power. All right, now let's pivot to Japan, because their story is completely different. While Hitler was twisting the law to get what he wanted, Japan's path was way, way bloodier. Over there, the military didn't play by the rules. They essentially kidnapped the government through pure, brutal violence. And to understand what happened in Japan, you have to know this one word, Gekgokujo. It's this deeply rooted tradition in their military where lower ranks could basically disobey or even kill their superiors if they believed it was for the good of the country. It was like a sanctioned culture of rebellion from below. And make no mistake, this was not just some abstract idea. They put it into practice, brutally. Three prime ministers were assassinated in the 1930s. In one famous incident, 1,000 soldiers just attacked the prime minister's home. The message they were sending was absolutely brutally clear. If you stand in the military's way, you will be killed. And just like that, the military became the silent, terrifying master of Japan. So let's just boil it down. You had Germany with this bottom-up takeover using the ballot box as its weapon, and then you had Japan, a top-down military hijack using the sword. Two totally different playbooks, but they ended up on the exact same page, an aggressive, expansionist dictatorship. Okay, so you've got these two aggressive new powers rising. What's the rest of the world doing about it? Well, this brings us to one of the most disastrous policies in modern history, appeasement. Or, as I like to call it, feeding the tiger and just hoping it eats you last. As Mussolini's Italy rolled into Ethiopia, as Japan pushed deeper and deeper into China, the world's big democracies, Britain and France, what did they do? Well, pretty much nothing. Oh, sure, they'd give some fiery speeches at the League of Nations, but the words were completely hollow. They just watched, and they waited. And here's the crazy part. They absolutely had the power to stop it. Just look at Italy's invasion of Ethiopia. Britain controlled the Suez Canal. I mean, That was the main artery, the only real supply line for the entire Italian army. So that begs the obvious question, doesn't it? Why on earth didn't they just close the canal? They could have choked off the invasion without firing a single shot. So why didn't they? Well, this is where we get into the really twisted logic of it all. The leaders in Britain and France saw Nazi Germany and Soviet Russia as these two massive threats, and their secret, cynical hope was that if they just let Hitler get a little stronger, he wouldn't come for them. No, he'd turn east and go after the Soviet Union, let our two biggest enemies destroy each other. It was a terrifying game of trying to shift the disaster onto somebody else. And this whole disastrous idea reached its absolute climax in 1938 at the infamous Munich conference, a meeting that was supposed to guarantee peace for our time, but instead pretty much guaranteed a world war. Now, this is super important to understand. When Hitler started making demands on Czechoslovakia, this was no pushover. We're not talking about some helpless little country. I mean, check this out. They were the seventh largest industrial power on the planet. They had a modern army, incredible defenses, and they were absolutely ready and willing to fight Hitler. But their own allies, they sold them out. I mean, this is just humiliating. At the big conference in Munich, the Czech diplomats weren't even allowed in the room. They were literally told to wait in the hallway while Britain and France gave Hitler a huge chunk of their country. So the British Prime Minister, Neville Chamberlain, he flies back to London, he waves this piece of paper that Hitler had signed, and he told the cheering crowds these now infamous words. And the craziest part? He genuinely believed it. He thought he had saved the world from war. Well, he couldn't have been more wrong. That piece of paper? It was meaningless. The ink was barely dry on the agreement before Hitler broke his promise. Appeasement didn't satisfy the tiger. It just proved to the tiger that it could get whatever it wanted. And within 6 months, Hitler's tanks rolled into Prague and swallowed the rest of the country. And that brings us to the final jaw-dropping plot twist. Remember that whole strategy from Britain and France? You know, the one where they hoped the Nazis and the Soviets would just kill each other off? Well, in August 1939, those two mortal enemies did the absolute unthinkable. They signed a pact. They made a deal to carve up Europe between them. And with that deal, Hitler's eastern border was secure. He had the green light he'd been waiting for. On September 1st, 1939, German forces stormed into Poland. And just like that, the fragile 20-year peace was shattered. The Second World War was on. And it all leaves us with this one haunting question that hangs over the entire era. How could the most horrific war in human history possibly happen when almost everyone involved was so desperately trying to stop it?